Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about the absolutely brutal Kushiel's Justice by Jacqueline Carey. So this might be the first trilogy I've read where the story, like especially the second book in a trilogy, like right off the bat it just goes from 0 to 100 with nary a breath. I can't think of any other book where something like that happened. And even more interesting, it's a largely self-contained story that is also a very strong build-up to what promises to be a very interesting conclusion, because I do remember how the first trilogy in this Namaz universe happened, and it was very similar to this. The second book was just this really good unfolding build up, and then the third book came like a gut punch out of nowhere. I suspect that Jacqueline Carey set, given how this book read, I suspect Jacqueline Carey setting us up for exactly the same thing all over again with an all new cast of characters. But of course, she has to top what she did in the first trilogy, so I suspect we're in for an even worse gut punch here. But yeah, what happens? So, following the events of his 1 year's journey out of court, Imriel returns to the court of Teradaj, and almost immediately the feelings and the sensations that he had for Sidonie, his cousin, Sidonie de la Corcelle, who is the heir to the throne, they kind of blow right up into outright passion. And the initial first part of this book is spent with the two of them kind of delving into that relationship, while at the same time acknowledging the fact that there's no way it can ever go beyond the darling that they were doing, because after all, she's the heir to the empire and she's the heir to the throne, and he is the son of the realm's most infamous traitor. But at the same time, Emil is very cognizant of his role. He has made a very conscious decision to follow his aunt's lead and to do whatever to play whatever role she decides he must fulfill as within his capacity as a royal, as a royal. And when that choice gets made for him with a political marriage, it breaks his heart to do it, but he does set out to fulfill his he does set out to try and make the best of this marriage, this political marriage that he gets placed in. But from the outset, it becomes clear to his wife that this is like there's someone else in the picture, and their story unfolds in a very strange and very interesting way that it culminates in an event that kind of frees Emil from his burden. And on one hand, it does feel a bit deus ex machina and convenient. On the other hand, you do have to remember that one of the core tenets from and this is book 5 technically, but one of the core tenets from the very first book is love as thou wilt. And in this book, Emil is very consciously making the decision to turn his back on that tenet, which is a tenet of the religion in this world. And what happens there, we can kind of interpret as the consequence of ignoring that tenet, because this is a series where the gods are very much present. They don't necessarily actively play a role beyond what their larger influence is. But Emil's situation is different in that his line is quote unquote this Scion of Kushiel. So yeah, the story largely after this is with Emil dealing with the consequences of certain events that happens with this political marriage, until he eventually returns back home to Teradaj and he and Sidonie expectantly they decide to hell with it, they're gonna go public with their relationship. That all sounds very romancy and whatever, but this book for the large part of it, it does read more like high fantasy, but romance is a pretty big facet of it. Not like, not to the point where it tiresome to read about or it detracts from the story. It just kind of complements it, as all the previous books have. But first and foremost, these are very character driven, very intense high fantasy stories. But yeah, that's that's a very long way of kind of describing what happens in this book. But let me just say right off the bat, this is an absolutely brutal story. Absolutely, absolutely brutal. Like, Jacqueline Carey is one of that core facet of authors who they just like to put their characters through some pretty dark, some pretty disturbing situations, some pretty brutal situations. And before Imriel even became a main character in her series, he already went through some stuff. Some stuff that would break ordinary people. So for him to go through what happens to him in this book is just, it's just sick. There is a point after which you kind of have to wonder if an author is just being sociopathic with their characters. And for me, this book was that kind of trigger point. Like, it's just insane what she makes him go through. Like, it was hard to read. It was hard to read, to say the least. Like, needless to say, extremely character driven story. Like, Imriel gets put through the ringer and a half in this book. He has this whole thing with Sidney, but then he accepts his aunt's judgment and his role that he has to fulfill, and he sets off. He doesn't necessarily do it happily, but he sets off, and he tries to make the best with the hand that's dealt with him. But what happens with that hand is just, ugh. There's no winning for this guy, apparently. But yeah, one other thing about this book is that from the pretty much the very first book, we were introduced to this land of Alba, which is essentially like a fictionalized version of England, and we get some teasers as to how this country is set up, but we've never like really seen in depth how, like, what it's like. We've been exposed to different parts of this world by this point, but we've never really gotten a good look at Alba. And this is the book where we finally got a good look at it, and it's very much like Dark Ages, like pre-Dark Ages. It's very much like pre-Dark Ages melding into Dark Ages. Like, books are pretty much non-existent, that kind of thing, in this land. And the magic is wilder, it's stranger, the gods are more pagan, and it's something that Imriel almost immediately runs afoul of, with a very, in a very dark way, with some very dark consequences. Like, it was interesting because it's very different from what we've seen so far in this series, and yeah, it was interesting. What else can I say about this book? This book, at the end of the day, it all comes back to Jacqueline Carey. Like, she's just an amazing writer. She has to be an amazing writer because these books are extremely character driven, and you do have to be a very good writer to manage to create engrossing characters that will hook the reader and hook them for the sheer page count that these books tend to have. Like, these books are fat, and she does manage it. She not just manage it, but keep you engaged, keep you wanting to find out more, keep you reading more. And she proves that terrible things can happen without necessarily resorting to what we traditionally think of as violence. There's much darker, much more evil things people can go through, much more traumatic things, and we kind of see that glaringly happen to Imriel in this book. Like, it takes a good author to really turn those screws on you, and Jacqueline Carey certainly has the chops to do it. But yeah, that's I think that's kind of all I have to say on this book. It's another great installment to what's been a really great high fantasy series. I continue to be disappointed in the way that these books were marketed and pitched. Like, they are very character driven stories. They are very I've read a lot of female written fantasy at this point, and I can think of numerous series that these books can stand tall against. It's just unfortunate that because the romance element is a little bit heavier than it would be in those books, these books were marketed as primarily romance books when they're not. Like, the I would say of the different elements that make up these books, the romance aspect like might be maybe 5 to 10%, if so much. Like, there's so many other things going on in these books, so many other fascinating facets, so many other just dark and disturbing things that really get you going. And I like I said, the marketing is a tragedy, but yeah, I'm glad I'm one of the few people who decided to make, like, one of the people who decided to give this series a shot. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, and that's it. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. So, if by some miracle you've made it this far into this video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.